The story of Force of Will is an interesting one. A small company that wanted to make a fun niche Japanese card game, by accident makes a game so good and so popular, it briefly rivals Pokemon, Magic, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Then, after the game inevitably fails due to a misunderstanding of what they've made, the company becomes one of the most transparent and player-friendly games through a massive effort to recover. However, the company can't ever get the player base completely back, and has to deal with an ever-dwindling supply of money. Despite this, the game continues to move on, improving on past mistakes, surviving way too many Tier 0 formats, a lot of failed projects, and even a hostile takeover along the way. This video is trying to break down the history of the surprisingly amazing card game, from the rapidly evolving metagame, to the absurd crash and surprising rebound of the secondary market. This is the history of the Force of Will TCG.
Oh boy.
Hello, Knuckles. You have a lot of nerve coming in here.
You have a lot of nerve being alive.
Captain?
Oh, yeah.
Force of Will was originally the creation of Eiji Shishido, formerly a Magic the Gathering player, who wanted to create a game to do two things. First, to fix several of the major issues with Magic the Gathering, everything from mana screw to pricing. Second, Force of Will would be targeted to the Japanese market. This meant, from a design standpoint, the game would be embracing casual-friendly design, as well as not avoiding things such as power creep. The team behind Force of Will swears behind one big thing, and that is the concept of connection and communication. They want the game to bring people together, and that sense of community is going to play a big role in why the game has stuck around for so long. Too many companies like Konami and Wizards of the Coast frankly just abuse their players in local game stores. When I first read about Force of Will Company's goals and mottos, I thought it was just corporate nonsense. But no, they are surprisingly committed to maintaining and supporting the community, despite what hiccups and mistakes happen along the way. Before we can progress further into the game's history, let me explain more in depth how the game is actually played. There are three parts to consider when building a deck. A ruler who's always available throughout the game, with a wide variety of effects that help determine a deck strategy. These rulers can evolve into a more powerful J-ruler through judgment after paying a cost at some point in the game. The second most important part of the game is the Magic Stone deck, basically a collection of mana or resource sources that your leader can call out to the battlefield each turn. Some stones will have additional effects. The third and most important part of the game is the actual deck, consisting of three main card types for now. Resonators are this game's version of monsters or creatures. Chance your spells perform the role of activated or response effects. Lastly, additions function as equip cards or field-wide cards. The goal of this game is to use a combination of these three to decrease the opponent's life points to 0. There are 5 colors of mana in this game, called Will, which is similar to Magic's 5 colors of mana. To better understand what the game is like, here's a breakdown of the color identities in Force of Will. Some of it is very standard to other card games, like red being the color of aggro. Some things are very different, such as green being the color with the most counterspells. I think green is generally considered to be the best color, but it does change depending on the format, and the colors have blended together slightly over time. The game is split into 3 main formats: Origin, Wanderer, and New Frontiers. New Frontiers is the format of set rotation, being only the 2 newest clusters in the game. For most of the game's history, the New Frontiers format would be the main competitive draw for the game. Origin is the format about playing with cards from all sets. Origin has a bit of overlap with the Wanderer format, the difference being that Wanderer does not include cards from Valhalla cluster, and maintains a unique ban list to ensure balance in the format. Sometime between 2019 and 2021, Wanderer format would become the most popular format of Force of Will to be played competitively, but we'll get to that later. The first cluster released for Force of Will would be Valhalla cluster, containing only 3 sets in the Japanese release, releasing around 2012 and 2013, and there would be 2 sets for the English release, releasing around 2014. It helps to think of this cluster as a sort of trial run for the rest of the game. The development of this cluster was very taxing. Members of the earliest team would fall in and out of work. More than that, the team for the game was the smallest at the time, so the work was more draining on everyone involved. There was little to nothing planned around the release of sets after the first set, and work was done when they got to it. Eiji Shishido would say about development at that time,
いやもうですね、2段の頃からですね、意識はなかったんですよね。人としてもう終わっちゃってたんですよ。こうもう本当にひどかったんですよ。もう思考能力も止まって、うつ病気味になって人生終わったで。
The game's core team would go from convention to convention, trying to get the game's spark to catch. While the hard work wouldn't directly generate the sales the team would need for a full English launch, It would begin to build a very long-lasting community that would carry the game through its worst times. Despite the mixed results, the team would work to make 3 full sets released over 3 years on the Japanese market, and would later release these as 2 sets on the English market in limited locations. Information about the Valhalla meta and top strategies is kind of a black hole of information, at least on the English side of things. Unfortunately, despite Valhalla Cluster releasing to some success and praise, major issues would hold down the success at key points. On the Japanese side of things, by the release of the 3rd set, sales would decrease to a dramatic point, forcing the company to look at making big changes to how the game was run. On the English side of things, the company would produce only around 100,000 packs, or about 1 million cards. For context, the modern Magic the Gathering set Battle for Zendikar has an estimated print run of 2.5 billion cards. In other words, the run was extremely small and did not sell according to the company's expectations. Despite these failures, the company would ultimately find some success in the markets of Southeast Asia, particularly in Hong Kong, the Philippines, and Malaysia. But why did this cluster almost fail in the Western and Japanese markets? Let's look at the most likely reasons as to why. Quite a few accounts point to very atrocious and borderline predatory pull rates for super rare and higher cards in the set's boxes. Basically, players would only be able to pull around 1 or 2 super rares per box, and with around 15 total rares in the set, this left players needing an insane amount of boxes to fully build out decks. A now deleted user on Reddit would post of his experience opening product. My set 3 boxes each had 1 SR ruler, 1 UR ruler, but I'm told I was lucky. Apparently each case has 27 SR, only 5 UR rulers, and 1/2 RR rulers. A case of 16 boxes, you open either 2 SR or 1 SRU ruler. That also explains high Japanese prices on weak rulers like Monument and Salamander, lol. English boxes fixed this by bundling parts of set 2 with 1 and 3. So a set 1 box is like 1.5 and set 2, 2.5. There are no set 3 English boxes. Same apparently goes for all other languages. I don't know for sure, but apparently the pull rates are better. The card quality was also reportedly lower than later sets, and had tons of inconsistencies. This might be because art and text placement often ended up being done by hand by the printers themselves in the early runs. Overall, this combined with the difficulty to pull cards would hurt the game's word of mouth during the early period. I am glad to say this trend would not stick around after this set. Mechanically, the game featured a comeback mechanic called Life Break that would be removed following this set. It functioned similarly to a prize card system, where cards would be set off top deck face down. However, in Force of Will, these cards could be accessed at certain intervals of life points, and a player could use a card's special life break ability for free if the card had one. As anyone could tell you, it was extremely luck-based. The mechanic reviewed extremely badly, and most people believe that it was for the best it got removed. So, overall, Valhalla Cluster would be a weird experimental period of the game's history. Judging from the early performance, who could have predicted the game would find insane success as a competitive card game in the next cluster, Grimm? Grimm Cluster is the most well-known block from Force of Will's history. It's not hard to see why. With its beautiful presentations of reimagined fairy tale classics, combined with just a hint of Lovecraftian terror, the art in this game is unforgettable. The 4 sets and 1 side set in this cluster were released in early 2015. During this era, the team would switch to a Taiwanese printing company to fix card quality. This company would be responsible for establishing the standard, high-quality cards that Force of Will would be known for. The first 2 sets of Grimm Cluster would be released together on the English market. This was done in order to fix the issues created by a small card pool as seen in Valhalla Cluster. This opening period of the game's meta is remembered very fondly. A combination of all the classic deck themes combined with a much faster pace than the average game standard block, made for incredibly skill-based and intensely fun gameplay. Design-wise, cards as a whole are incredibly cheaply costed. The average mana cost in these sets is very close to 2 mana, compared to Magic the Gathering's higher varying 3 to 4 average cost per card. Combining the similarities to Magic and the built-in leader, this meant games could end very sharply if one player was unskilled. Following the concept of low-cost cards, typically most decks will go out of their way to splash in a few powerful staple cards from the format. The most notable of which is the controversial Cheshire Cat. This card for simple 1-drop provides a clean draw 2 filter, is a cheap blocker, and has built-in targeting protection. This card should give you a picture for the power level of the game, which will get even more surprising when you realize how quickly this would later be power crept out of the meta. Surprisingly though, the power of this card isn't what made it so controversial. As you might have noticed, I've censored this card because quite frankly, I'm terrified of being demonetized. On a different platform, I'd show you the ass and let you decide whether or not it's okay for its 13+ age rating. Unfortunately, people have been demonetized for less. What made this artwork even more interesting and controversial is that a misprint version of this card would be released with the cat in question not wearing pants. A popular myth is that this version of the card occurred because the original artist was denied using this variant of the artwork and snuck in an uncensored version into the print run at the last second, and no one noticed. Back to looking at the gameplay. We're left with several very solid and dynamic competitive decks that would trade top spots throughout the early sets. Grimm, a utility-based multicolored tempo deck, being able to get the best card for any situation. Alucard, a purple vampire control combo deck featuring an explosive top-in and tons of control pieces. Abdul, a green-purple chant-based control deck. And lastly, Fault Gold, a mono-red aggro deck all about just going face. These decks rewarded matchup knowledge and preparing options to counter specific opponents' strategies. Players would be rewarded in going so far as to even side in a different ruler. Following this was the release of the block's third and fourth set, Moon Priestess's Return and Millennia of Ages. The early decks would more or less prove to be the strongest, taking in new staple and tech additions from the new sets, with perhaps one or two new rulers shaking up the metagame. While we're here, the Pilot and the Little Prince are by far my favorite cards in the game. I've seen a lot for this video, and this is the peak. During this meta, Force of Will, a game originally intended as a casual Japanese TCG, would capture the hearts and minds of many competitive players worldwide. First springing up as a popular game in Italy, Force of Will would eventually go viral to all corners of the globe. Sales throughout the first 3 sets would rival even Yu-Gi-Oh! And Magic. Big players from other games would get involved in Force of Will. For example, here's a top 8 report showing Jeff Jones of Yu-Gi-Oh! Fame. Unfortunately, since the design team at Force of Will Company didn't have any checks on their work or outside references to understand what the players actually wanted, this success could not last forever. There's one thing I haven't gone too into depth on yet that's an unshakable part of this game's history. That's the financial disaster and collapse of the game. The first 3 sets, Crimson Moon's Fairy Tale, Castle, and Priestess Returns, all sold like hotcakes, making ridiculous waves on the TCG market. Sets would have insane value and be impossible to get. So when the 4th set, Millennia of Ages, was announced, stores went overboard and overbought on the product to follow the hype. However, a massive mistake on the company's part would result in the set itself being less than ideal and would end up destroying the game's financial reputation. The set, Millennia of Ages, would only contain 50 cards when compared to the usual 100, along with no new rulers. More importantly, the set would only contain around 2 meta-relevant cards. This meant that buying one box could almost complete the whole set, and competitive players could almost outright skip buying the set entirely. It would sell so badly that some shops would end up going out of business. While the set was inarguably a disaster, there's quite a lot more to the story than just that. First, we need to consider the nature of set releases prior to this. Force of Will Company, the company behind Force of Will obviously, opted to catch the English releases of the game up to the Japanese releases of the game, meaning that the sets which came out over a year in Japan had less than 6 months to release in America. I also don't think it's fair to say that this set would end up taking stores out of business. No store would be stupid enough to actually take on the multiple tens of thousands of dollars in product of a small set in a new game that would be needed to bankrupt them. If they did, it would only be a matter of time anyway. The more accurate truth is that it just soured LGS's opinions on carrying the product by just being a titanic loss. It definitely did bomb though, there's no denying that. Fun fact, this set is still behind my locals counter, not selling even to this day. Retrospectively, it's hard not to see the unfortunate pattern that arose during Grimm Cluster. Following the popularity, the sudden rise, and quick turnaround of events came to sellers hoping to get an infinite set of returns on the product's hype. This trend is of course unsustainable and inevitably would lead to player burnout, and the seller bubble would pop. With the Needle being an incredibly bad product, distributors would lose faith in the game, directly telling the company Force of Will would fail by 2017. Following this debacle, the mainstream exit of Force of Will would be sealed in by a series of bad metas, and a decline in player numbers would follow. Around here is where a lot of Force of Will stories tend to effectively end. But if you remember from the chart before, this game is still going. It never really stopped. In fact, it appears to be growing. What happened? And what is so special about this game that kept it around for over 10 years? There comes a time in every card game's life which the same crisis inevitably occurs. One deck, usually through accident, ends up overpowering the rest to an unmanageable extent. Unfortunately, for Force of Will, this happened very early on in its lifetime, near the beginning of the first real block. What would do it was the release of a new card type called Regalia. In a previous structure deck, this new mechanic was a unique type of equip card, specifically for your ruler. A new mechanic with very little interaction at the time. More than that was the lack of cost in the two Regalias released, being completely free to play, requiring 0 mana. This combined with the already low mana cost of cards in the game would inevitably result in a broken strategy wherever the effects of the Regalia happen to land. In the case of this game, the best Regalia's effect was in adding swiftness, or this game's version of haste. So it turned Fault Gold, an already powerful deck, into an unstoppable Tier 0 format. Lovingly called Baja Blast after its J-Ruler form Bahamut, this deck took over the competitive scene as quickly as it ended games. Fun fact, the average mana cost in this deck is less than 1, not including the side deck. An example turn 1 play could be, play Demon Sword, discard another Demon Sword to produce 1 red will. Play a Ruck Egg, and then sacrifice that Ruck Egg to J-activate into Bahamut, searching your deck for any red creature in the process. Swing for 1,200 damage on turn 1 without spending any mana, and this would be considered an unoptimal turn. Baja Blast and the failure of Millennia of Ages will leave the first real block of Force of Will to end on an incredibly frustrating note. We've already dived into very early Alice Cluster with Baja Blast, and the introduction of the first Regalia. But the release of structure decks was only a preview of the full format. Since Valhalla block was weird, this is the second set of blocks in the rotating format, making the game have a very large card pool for the first time. This cluster would run from late 2015 up through the first half of 2016. This would become the common release schedule for clusters. This new cluster would feature a new setting from the previous set, now mostly being inspired by classic Arthurian legend and English folklore. But these new sets wouldn't leave old characters like Alice outside of the story. The cluster's first set would release with 6 new Regalia, proving Regalia would be a major part of this cluster's design. The new Regalia, combined with several new rulers, would break through the previous Tier 0 deck's grip on the game. Interestingly, a lot of these newer strategies that would see competitive play would be those that featured cards directly opposed to the previous format's rush options. Razorgill Rabus, a new ruler, would get the Judgment for free if an opponent progressed into their J-Ruler. On its Judgment, it would then destroy the opponent's J-Ruler, making the card a massively powerful deterrent. With Rabus's control established, and then combined with some ramp cards, more high-cost cards could see play. Vlad Tepes, another popular J-Ruler from the very end of Grimm Cluster, would also be a popular control option. The 2 new Regalia that would become the most popular in this meta would both be generic removal or control options. Artemis the God's Bow would function as a new source of removal damage, and Death Scythe, the Life Reaper, would prevent Imperishable and Swiftness, a direct counter to Baja Blast. Simply put, if the combo and rush options would be cheap, so too would this game's removal, adding back the sense of high-skill gameplay that made this game initially take off. However, this was done at the cost of creating an extremely control-heavy environment that some players would find very unfun. Set 2 of Grimm Cluster, the Twilight Wanderer, contained some very controversial new cards and mechanics. Outside of several new Regalia and even more control options, a new ruler Reflect Child of Potential and its respected J-Ruler Refrain Child of Convergence would release with some very unfortunate problems. Similar to other previous rulers, it would be a very efficient value engine, providing access to draws, negates, and removal. This alone would have made an incredibly versatile and powerful ruler, but the ruler also would not have attack and defense stats, making it not vulnerable to previous forms of J-Ruler removal. More specifically, the only cards which could destroy Refrain were Siege Warfare, Helsing the Vampire Hunter, and Blazergill Rabus, each with unique conditions about when they could be used. However, all of these could be responded to by just unflipping Refrain, and although Siege Warfare and Artemis could get around this, they were essentially ruler locked. This would create an engine only the controlling player could interact with. Reflect and Refrain created an environment where it didn't really matter what deck you were playing. Reflect and Refrain just made the deck better than it was what the original ruler intended for it. To that end, it made decks themselves varied, but the rulers were very monotonous at the top tables of Force of Will. This led to player frustration because the main draw of Force of Will was the uniqueness of the rulers. This created a meta that was very similar to previous sets, but instead with Refract and Refrain as the chosen rulers. Due to the overall power creep in the game, fewer and fewer cards from Grimm clusters would be seen. Set 3 and 4 would follow this trend with some minor variations. There's a weird design strategy that Force of Will Company would try to use following the release of Refract and Refrain. That would be, instead of directly banning or limiting cards, to instead release direct counters to problematic cards. This, however, would just backfire, creating more power creep. For example, the card Black Moonbeam could be used to remove Reflect and Refrain, but the card's bigger and better use would be as a side deck card to counter non-Refract and Refrain rulers. By the fourth set of Alice Cluster, the meta had evolved into several different types of Refract and Refrain decks. Aggro, Beast Synergy, various control decks, and even a Necrolance combo. Control builds would use one of several of the mini spell negates released in Set 3 of Grimm Cluster, combined with big game enders like Fallen Angelic Destroyer Lucifer, who gives both removal and massive life point swings. Aggro builds would use the standard package of cheap 1-2 drop resonators with swiftness, mixed in with a healthy dose of burn spells. Necrolance is an interesting aggro combo deck based around using the card Necromancy of the Underworld and Lancelot the Knight of Mad Demon. Lancelot has a secondary effect to deal damage to a resonator once its attack was over a certain threshold, meaning that by being combined with Necromancy and other buff cards, an aggro list could pick up both control options and more damage. Of course, outside of the Refract and Refrain decks, there were sporadically outside rulers such as Xion, a deck about being able to consistently get free value, and synergizing with the Hydromonica Regalia for searching. Another ruler would be Dark Alice, threatening both graveyard control and massive late game combos. All in all, Alice Cluster presented what was technically a very diverse meta, with unique mechanics and tons of interesting ideas. But the cluster would end up on a very similar note to the previous Grimm Cluster, with players feeling like only one deck would be valid. Things weren't much better on the market side of things either. In July 2016, Force of Will would release Vengolf 2 Valkyria Chronicles, the second in a series of side sets containing both new themes and some reprints. The series is a fixed set, meaning every box would contain the same cards. But what makes this particular set so notable is three factors. First, the set is a crossover set with the somewhat obscure video game franchise Valkyria Chronicles. Second, the set contained no meta-relevant cards. Third, the set is the worst performing set in the entirety of Force of Will history. Thanks to a 2019 interview with Jeff Finnegan, the head of global communications of Force of Will, with Rudy at Alpha Investments, we now know much more about the development process behind the set than was known at the time. Vengolf 2 was designed first as a casual product. As such, there are very few competitive cards in the box to ensure competitive players wouldn't buy out the product, so that casual players could always see the set in stores. Yeah, this is the actual reason given. In the Japanese market, where players are a lot more casual, this design was less not okay. However, this was such a disaster, some European countries did not translate the set, nor purchase any product for their entire countries. According to the interview with Jeff Finnegan, the design and development team at the time did not have any expectation of succeeding on an international level during the Grimm Cluster. There were no international consultants or English-speaking team members. As such, the game in 2015-2016 exclusively catered to the Japanese market with crazy power creep, flashy combos, and very over-the-top power levels, as well as producing exclusively casual-focused products. This issue also explains the previous errors with the set Millennia of Ages. The set wasn't advertised correctly, and shouldn't have been considered a full booster set. Instead, it should have been a smaller mini booster, such as like the deck builder packs in Yu-Gi-Oh! Or the crossover sets in Vanguard. After these two failures, Force of Will Company would scramble to put checks in place to stop this from ever happening again. After 2016, the company would maintain an international standard of card power level and card power creep. Decisions were made at the company to ensure main sets from this failure onwards would always have rulers and be more than 50 cards. And, to the company's credit, these particular types of mistakes wouldn't be made again. We'll talk more about the interview that happened in 2019 in part 2. But for now, just know that this interview, along with several other actions, have shown Force of Will Company, and then later I Spy Productions, to be incredibly transparent. Let's move forward to the release of Lapis Cluster. Lapis Cluster began releasing in late 2016 with the release of Curse of the Frozen Casket, up until 2017 with the release of Echoes of the New World. Going back to the world of fairy tales, this cluster continued the world and story of Grimm Cluster. Lapis Cluster had the very unfortunate task of repairing the game's reputation in both the eyes of the player base and the distributors. Preemptively, before the start of this new format, Force of Will would implement for the first time a ban list for the New Frontiers format. This was the first big change the Force of Will team would make during this cluster to try to repair the game in the eyes of the consumers. There was only one card on this initial ban list: the previously explained Refract and Refrain. Unlike some other games, Force of Will would issue a massive statement and explain the reasons on both sides regarding the banning. The ultimate reasoning being, while the number of decks using Refract and Refrain was high, much of it was because many players felt there was no other option. We want players to feel that they can have fun with all sorts of rulers and decks, especially with how much work we put into the rulers of Lapis Cluster. Additionally, when creating a new deck, we don't want a player's first thought to be how to counter Refract Refrain. This would signal a big change in the design of rulers in the future. Most would not function as generic value engines, and instead would be focused around supporting a specific strategy. That way, players can more consistently get to use their unique ruler, which feels special to them. A more interesting thing that got revealed in this discussion was how the Force of Will team had been trying to release cards into new sets that could directly counter problem cards. I swear, most TCGs do things like this all the time, but the transparency here to confirm this is really special. Later, this ban list would expand into a new ban list for the Wanderer format, banning a whopping 8 cards, as well as adding some new cards to the New Frontiers ban list. We'll get to that as they come. So, what was this post-ban list format actually like? During the release of the first 2 sets, several defining strategies would be seen. Rulers from this cluster would make use of the Energize mechanic, a skill that would give the player going second a single-use free source of mana. Energize would be an immensely popular mechanic, with most meta decks playing one of the new rulers. Valentina 3.0 is a deck all about turboing out chance for free value. It's part control deck, part value, and part combo. It's got insane cards like Plot of Water and Darkness and Space and Time Anomaly. Valentina 2.0 is a different Valentina deck that I'm not going into detail on, but I would like to thank the designers of this game for making it as confusing as possible to research this game and its meta. Turbo Feising is a deck that uses the ruler Feising to spam out a ton of elf tokens and then later buff their attack. This strategy was supported by a variety of cheap and low-cost resonators for more swarming. Finishing up the strategy was cards like Titania, Prideful Queen, to take advantage of the tokens produced. Lumia is a blink ruler. This deck is all about triggering and re-triggering on-enter effects, abusing powerful on-enter effects such as Captain Hook the Pirate. All these decks competed in a relatively balanced format. Overall, I feel like this cluster did a much better job of balancing the ratio of cards used from this and the previous cluster, even if it was just running a bunch of regalia. Alongside the ban list and the really well-balanced meta, Force of Will Company announced a new plan to help players do something with all of their bulk that had piled up from set rotation and power creep. By mailing in a set collection of cards directly to the company, players would receive a new powered-up version of an old ruler. The Ascension campaign was a way to breathe new life into some fan-favorite but underutilized rulers. The idea was, you collected enough copies of these related cards, plus the ruler themselves, sent them into the company, and were sent back the upgraded version. It was met with mixed reviews, but overall the rulers were very cool and fun to utilize. One even made a deck that had no chance of being successful find its way to a top 8 finish because of the upgrade to the ruler. I personally have some mixed feelings about the Ascension campaign. On one hand, it was a great way to win back some old players and generate hype. On the other hand, I think the campaign was at least partially a manipulation of the secondary market, as it inflated the price of bulk cards created by set rotation and power creep. Honestly, the campaign was not a bad thing for the company overall, and hurt no one, but I'm just a bit hesitant about a company messing directly with card prices. During this time in 2016, a Force of Will movie was announced by Force of Will Company. It is one of a few side projects started by the company with the cash made from Grimm and Alice clusters. The movie would be an anthology featuring several stories from the Force of Will universe, most notable of which would be the first story dealing with Cthulhu. Unfortunately, 2 years later in 2018, this movie would announce to have been scrapped. The explicit reason given was, in the end, it was not something we could accomplish in a state, with limited time and budget, that I felt it represented us in our game. Unfortunately for Force of Will Company, this would only be the beginning of their financial problems. Also around this time, Force of Will Company would begin work on 2 new card games, Castor Chronicles and Architects. Where Architect would never end up seeing an English release, Castor Chronicles would see some minor success as a card game until its cancellation in 2019. Everything about the design of Castor Chronicles can be summarized by its motto: being able to collect cards of cute girls. That alone is fun. Castor Chronicles takes some less explored aspects of Force of Will and focuses on them, particularly looking at creating a more casual experience and experimenting by showing characters with, let's say, exaggerated proportions.
Humongous!
Caster Chronicles did not do well on the Western market. Speaking of which, let's go back to Force of Will. The meta going into set 3 and 4 was a little more defined than in previous eras. That's a euphemism for another borderline 1 or 2 deck format, where the best deck could clearly be defined as Precia the True Beast Master, a power-crept red-green deck with all the best options. Precia could use the Resonance mechanic to give Resonators either flying or swiftness to outmaneuver the opponent. Not only that, a cheap judgment cost meant this deck could easily abuse Precia's judgment ability to swap out the board. All around, this deck could just do more faster than most other decks, especially more than older decks. A strong secondary option for a deck in this format would be Nine-Tailed Fox. Fox has a unique gimmick of being able to search both the main deck and the side deck for massive Chimera Resonators and put them onto the field. This meant players could focus on running utility and combo pieces in the main while having a side deck full of most of the win-con Resonators. Before the release of the 4th and final set of Lapis Cluster, a new Frontiers ban list would be announced, adding on 2 Regalia, Leviathan the Demon Sword, which previously broke the game on its initial release, as well as Horn of Sacred Beast, a card that would generate free mana for Sacred Beast cards, and its more important effect, a shuffling both players' entire graveyards back into the deck. Leviathan was mostly a hit to Precia, but unfortunately, it wouldn't slow down the deck at all. By the end of this cluster, Precia and Fox would be the only 2 decks able to consistently see any competitive success, thanks to new support like Sylvia, Blade of the Supreme King, and Little Red, Fairy Tale of Air, which let the deck deal more damage faster. This late meta as a whole is very interesting. On one hand, the best decks are extremely fun to play and have unique mechanics that reward creative deck building. On the other hand, this was another power crept format that would drive some more of the audience away, leaving Lapis Cluster to end on a poor note like the clusters before it, despite all of the amazing progress Force of Will Company had made in fixing their mistakes. Reiya Cluster would be released from 2017 to 2018. Reiya Cluster is a weird era. Design-wise and company-wise, it's at the point that Force of Will Company begins to feel the sting of decreased sales. They've done a lot so far to try and repair the relationship with the players and distributors, but Force of Will has still fallen out of the limelight. To fix the remaining distrust, the Force of Will team opted to double down on creating new and exciting game mechanics to draw players in, resulting in Reiya being the cluster of gimmicks. Let's break down a few of these gimmicks, shall we? The weather mechanic would essentially boil down to 2 different weather states that would give additional triggered abilities to cards. The mechanic would be too slow, niche, and gimmicky for competitive success. It would be used for 1 starter deck and scant few cards in main sets, then never again. Gems are a new series of tokens that boil down to being counters for other abilities. The mechanic would be too slow, niche, and gimmicky for competitive success. It would be used for 1 starter deck and scant few cards in main sets, then never again. I think by now you get the point how a lot of these gimmicks would play out, but not all of them would go over this badly. I think the 2 standout mechanics to me from those clusters were Elementals and Inverse. Elementals were this really rewarding mechanic where you essentially could burn cards that you had already spent to play other types. So having this like recycling mechanic that gave a lot of flexibility, deck building freedom, and using cards in a different way was really neat. For Inverse, the front-back yin-yang design of them were just really fun to play around with, try to find which ones to make use of, when or which ones we would try to just straight cheat in using Amuel. It was a fun deck style, truly unique building experience. These more extreme mechanics would have varying degrees of success. While most of them were popular at the time and would be fondly loved by players, the niche nature of these decks made sure a lot of rulers from this cluster would not hold up in the long term. The most questionable new mechanic was the sealed item mechanic. This gimmick would involve rulers getting released each set in the cluster, with progressively more and more abilities and text. Mechanically, this would function as a series of errata, where all rulers could be treated as having the text of the most recently released variant. Despite the potential excitement of this new mechanic, there would be a few issues that would pop up. The sealed item mechanic was an experiment that was just not executed well. Players understood what they were going for, with the idea of the same characters getting improved throughout the story of the cluster without having to fully redesign them. But it led to a logistical, set design mess in terms of ruler pull rates, trying to explain the idea to new players, etc. Another big move in trying to promote new interest in the game would be in changing box structure to promote draft play. In Reiya Cluster, and for some future clusters, boxes would be geared towards drafting, a format about building decks with cards pulled from packs. Boxes would include 5 generic rulers to ensure players could play without having to pull a broken ruler. However, this format would suffer some hiccups early on. Due to how powerful the ruler mechanic could be, games could often be decided by who pulled a powerful ruler and could build around it. This variance would lead to some imbalance that would sour a lot of players' opinion on the format. While this would initially be addressed by AG Shishido in an update by making generic or draft rulers the only allowed rulers in the format, the damage would already have been done, and this potential format would eventually fall out of regular support. In Reiya Cluster, the company would also try and make a second go at promoting and maintaining an Eternal format. Wanderer would receive several new events and a new ban list around this time that would catch up the list to hit all of the new degenerate strategies that have shown up over the years. Similar to Refract and Refrain prior to Set 1 of Reiya Cluster releasing, Force of Will Company would announce a ban list hitting all of the previous problem decks. Precia would get banned, as well as the best Chimera target for Fox's skill, leaving a hole wide open in this meta for new and interesting decks. But this quick banning would have some adverse effects on the community, driving away some players who either wanted to play the previous 2 decks or wanted a more stable format. The ban list for the company has always been a bit of a hot topic. Sometimes they have jumped in rather quickly on a ban, still, others took quite a long time to enact any action. This led to a mixed opinion of the community in terms of the company's willingness to adjust the meta or make corrections after a set has released. Some players left the game over irritations about the ban list. Comparing that to now though, with the ban list / combination ban list for Wanderer that updates every 3 months, and the company's public commitment to using the ban list appropriately / actively, and many players have been very happy about the change. But, because of the aggressive ban list strategy, the early meta for Reiya Cluster would be considered quite good with a wide variety of decks playable. Returning strategies such as Lumina would see play alongside new rulers who got to impact the meta, such as Feyrul, an Elf Tribal deck, and Yggdrasil, Malefic Verdant Tree, a control-oriented strategy where taking regular damage would be replaced instead by decking out. But, like the previous clusters before it, a new dominant meta would arise in the later half of the cluster's run. In Reiya's case, it would be after the release of the 3rd set in the cluster, the Time-Spinning Witch, in which a new Tier 0 meta would arise based around the ruler, Scheherazade. Like most things from Reiya format, Scheherazade had a special gimmick. This gimmick, called Grimm let the player take with them an extra deck of 5 story chants. These could be accessed through Scheherazade's ruler abilities. This extra deck could be loaded with a series of control effects to perfectly respond to an opponent's strategy. Every single time. Being green, the deck also had access to counter spells and ramp. Once the game state had progressed far enough, the deck would take a big swing turn with their judgment ability, summoning out a bunch of dolls for free. According to stats released by Force of Will Company, the deck would dominate 69% of the metagame. No, that's not a joke, that is the actual stat. Contemporary accounts state the deck ended up being extremely linear and unfun to pilot in New Frontiers. But unlike in the previous Refract and Refrain meta, Scheherazade did not have the variety of deck builds that gave Refract and Refrain a surprisingly competitive and diverse format. Coinciding with the release of Set 4, 4 cards used in Scheherazade would be banned in New Frontiers, as well as with Scheherazade straight up getting banned in Wanderer. Unfortunately, this ban list did not have the impact Force of Will Company intended on the metagame. Instead of hitting the main engine, the ban list only hit pieces, allowing the deck to continue to dominate the metagame at a reduced 60% rate. Still technically Tier 0. After a few more months, the company would issue yet another ban list, this time banning Scheherazade from the format entirely. This quick, rapid-fire series of 3 ban lists and 1 block would only do more to harm the already smaller player base. The nomination of Scheherazade would bring to light a background issue with the design of Force of Will, an imbalance in power of colors. If you remember from the color pie I showed at the beginning, green has ramp, deck searching, and counter spells. Blue has all the funny bad things it does in Magic without the counter spells. As more and more cards were released, this problem would become more and more apparent, especially in Eternal formats like Wanderer, where decks could make use of every powerful option for green ever printed. At the time, this color balance was becoming an issue that would have to be addressed in future sets. A bit of a miscellaneous side note, I don't really know where else to put in the script. After this cluster, no card would be printed in main sets in Uber Rarity. I think it's a small way for the company to save money by not commissioning an extra art or printing it. Similar small downgrades would be made in clusters surrounding this era, such as a decreased box quality, like the physical materials the boxes were made out of. Also, there would be rulers without a proper changed art on their judgment side. All of these would be little things that, when added together, paint a poor picture of the game's financial health. Despite this, the physical card quality would never deteriorate. With cards maintaining a certain thickness and damage resistance, bigger card games abandoned for extra profit a while ago. During Reiya and Lapis cluster, things appeared to have been progressing normally. However, behind the scenes, the falling revenue and internal strife would cause a vulnerability in the company, opening up the small Force of Will company for what would become a hostile takeover. With a long-standing Eiji Shishodo, the original creator, along with Jeff and many more employees, would be fired. But that's a story for another time. It'll be covered in part 2 of this series, where everything from new Valhalla cluster to the ongoing Hero cluster will be covered. Featuring insane power creep, alienating a large chunk of the game's artist, and of course, a complete change in game design philosophy, part 2 will be quite a fun ride. Originally, this was supposed to be one large video, but I underestimated just how much stuff happened with this game. I think I would have a stroke if I ever tried to do this with an extremely long established and well documented game like Magic the Gathering. I hope everyone enjoyed this history video with a larger focus on the meta and mechanics of the game. Anytime people talk about Force of Will, it's usually only ever the financial side of the game. While this is important and super interesting, I find it fails to answer the question as to why Force of Will became successful in the first place. If you like this video and want more, make sure to subscribe. I feel it's fair to place that here. Leave a like and comment if you feel like I've missed anything. If you're interested in playing Force of Will, you should check out Ruler School TCG. He's the best channel for Force of Will content, and he helped me out with the writing of the script. You might have noticed a few of his quotes placed throughout the video. I've linked a few of his videos below if you want to check out Force of Will more. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in part 2.